Hello, I would like to explain on how to write a fourth species counterpoint with a given cantus firmus in the upper voice. It's probably one of the hardest things to do um, because we are very limited in terms of the suspensions. So generally speaking, fourth species is about suspensions. So that means a note. So we always have two half notes in the counterpoint, and in some of the measures, that note, the half note on the second half of a measure is tied over to the note of the following measure and becomes a dissonance and is then resolved down by step. So dissonances in fourth species fall only on the first half of a measure, not on any other parts of a measure. And generally speaking, in the strictest set of rules, only 2-3 suspensions are allowed. 2-3 suspensions. Now, the numbers go up because the resolution is down, so that means the interval widens, whereby if the cantus firmus would be in the lower voice and we would create suspensions in the upper voice, the numbers always go down, like 4, 3, 7, 8, 4, 3, 7, 6, 9, 8 suspensions. So if the cantus firmus is in the upper voice and the suspension is in the lower voice and resolves down by step, then the interval widens. And Fuchs really says only 2-3 suspensions are allowed, and their octave equivalents, which are 9-10 suspensions. Now, in some textbooks, you will read that 4-5 suspensions might be possible, but we should try to avoid 7-8 suspensions because those emphasize the octave and destroy the integrity of the counterpoint, because in the counterpoint we want to have as independent voices as possible. Anyways, we want to have a whole note in the very last measure, and we want to end on a unison, which then allows us to go back and kind of create a series of 2-3 suspensions. The question is where we actually start that, and we may have to correct something later on, but first of all, of course, we can also start on a unison, but I want to go backwards again a little bit. So now here we actually do, oh yeah, we can have a 2-3 suspension if we go down here, but meaning that this D to E is a 2 is first introduced as a consonance in the previous voice, like that. And then we have here a 2-3 suspension 2, which means could be something like that. So if we look at what we got, and this is a 2 also, so we probably can do it more than 3 times in a row. So I'm just trying to think on what I would put here. Maybe I have to, this is just a placeholder because I have to type in the first note first. And so really what I'm thinking is here you have a note which is a consonance, F up to A. Please always note that the lower treble clef here has an octave sign below, so it all sounds an octave lower. So that means this F is really the F above middle C, which is below this A. So this is a 3, the interval of a third. And now the cantus firmus moves down, but the F is tied over and becomes the interval of a second, which is the dissonance, falls on the first half of the measure, and then is resolved down by step. So it's a 2-3 suspension. And again, with the change of the cantus firmus voice, this becomes the interval of a second and third, so a 2-3 suspension. And here one more time, 2-3 suspension, and then the resolution toward the end. So this for now is just a placeholder. We will change that later. So going backwards was good for a little bit, and now I go back to the beginning and go forward. And maybe here we can have a series of 2-3 suspensions or 9-10 suspensions, depending on how they work out. Let's see if it's 9-10. Then it would be relatively low. That means there we would have to have a very large leap. If it's a 2-3 suspension, now actually 2-3 suspensions are preferred because the tension is greater, so that means it's a nicer resolution. If it's a 2-3 suspension, then we would have to get up here to this E, which will be very difficult to do coming from this D. And going down here to the E may be difficult too. So we may actually not have a suspension here, at least not a dissonant suspension, but we may have one here. And in this case, F to E, no, D to E would be the 9-10 suspension, the 9-10 suspension. So the question is on how we get down here. So we have to leap. If we leap down to F, that's a very large leap. But that would be the interval of a sixth, so from a unison down to sixth. Now that I think about this, I may actually change from starting on a unison to starting on an octave, at an octave. So that would be easier to get here. So octave, then going up to a sixth. I don't like that too much. What other options do we have? We can go down to a tenth. If we actually tie this over and we stay on the sixth, on this F, then we have an octave, which is a which is a consonance, of course. Um, and we want to probably avoid that because we started on an octave here. So again, that would destroy the integrity of the voice. So we may not have a suspension here right in that second measure. Maybe go... Yeah, this is a pretty tough one, because if I want this 9-10 suspension here in measure 3, then I have to have this D here on the second beat. I can't have E here, because that would be a dissonance, and the only time it would be allowed if that's a suspension, which would mean I have to have E here, but that can't be because that would be a dissonance then here on the second half of the measure. So if I would leap up even more to a 6 and back down to a 10th, that would sound relatively tonal. It would sound minor. It's not a great Renaissance voice leading. You want to avoid a lot of leaping, but as of right now, I cannot think of a better solution without dragging on this video for a very long time. So I will leave it like that for now. And so now I have a 9-10 suspension, and I will create one here too. No, that was the wrong note. Okay. What? Like that. 9-10. And if I so the problem is I left the voice here very low with a relatively large interval. So I once very briefly, I may have an interval larger than a 10th. And I have an octave displacement. So a leap of an octave essentially to leap up. So it's an octave and a sixth, and this is just a sixth. And then I can have one of those 4-5 suspensions. Now, in the strictest sense, I want to restrict myself to 2-3 suspensions, but 4-5 suspensions are occasionally allowed for most of the textbooks. I wanted to put the tie in first. So here is the interval. It's actually a diminished fifth. This is a 5-6 suspension. It is a 5-6 suspension, but a dissonance, which I think will sound okay. But then I have to leap up. So this is the interval of a sixth. This is the interval of a fifth. And I said earlier this was just a placeholder. But the question is, where would I put that note? So I cannot have a fifth here because it's approached by similar motion, and perfect intervals can only be approached in contrary motion or in oblique motion. Maybe I want to go down to the interval of a tenth between the lower voice and the upper voice, and then octave displays it to a third, right? So tenth, third, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, unison. So again, I'm not very happy about leaping, but here we have a 9, 10 suspension and 9, 10. Then an octave in the sixth, which is a one-time use of an interval larger than a tenth between the voices, but if that's octave displaced, that's allowable. So let me think very quickly if it is possible to actually change the beginning here. We could possibly, instead of starting on an octave, start on a fifth. Like this: fifth, sixth, sixth. So at least I got rid of one leap here, and it doesn't leap twice in the same direction. So we leap up and we leap down. We could also have, theoretically at least, an octave here. Since we didn't start on an octave, we could have an octave here, leaping down to a tenth. So this is a possibility. And in fact, then we could even tie this over, which would be more in the sense of fourth species, where we want most notes from the second half of a measure tied to the note, to the half note on the first half of the next measure. And now the only time that we don't do this is here and here. And well, we can actually tie this over. Of course, we cannot tie this over here. Although if we want to create a very strict one, we might, if we have an octave here, which then would be approached by oblique motion, and we tie this over. All right, good. Let me see what the analysis will be. So we start out on a perfect fifth, go to a sixth, F to D, right? Then F to F, this created an octave. It's approached by oblique motion. Leap down to a tenth. With the change of the cantus firmus, it becomes a 9, 10 suspension, and again a 9, 10 suspension. This is the interval of a 13th. It's always confusing. It's an octave plus a sixth. So 8 plus 6 equals a 13th in interval language, right? And then we octave displace that, and it becomes the interval of a sixth. And then with the change of the cantus firmus, we have a 5/6 suspension, which in the strictest sense maybe Fuchs would not be happy with, because this fifth is a dissonant fifth, it's a diminished fifth. But I think it will sound good once we play through this. And then we have an octave here. We leap up and have the interval of a third here, which then becomes a 2/3 suspension, and another 2/3 suspension, and another 2/3 suspension, followed by the unison. So we allowed one other kind of suspension, a dissonant suspension, as a diminished fifth going to a sixth. Let me hit save first, and then I will hit play. It sounds quite nice. Of course, and for some reason, my analysis just went away. So if I reopen this, because I fortunately saved it. So we always should be self-critical and see what is good and what is not so good. So one of the things is that I use one other kind of suspension that Fuchs would probably not have allowed. The other one is it has a relatively wide span in terms of the voice, going from a low B to a high F. Of course, this all sounds an octave lower, but in terms of voice range, that is quite wide. But this is an octave displacement, and this is actually the interval of a sixth, a leap of the sixth, followed by a change of directions going down. So it's not perfect having such a wide range, but I find it acceptable and it sounds pretty good. So again, writing those fourth species with a given cantus firmus in the upper voice is one of the most difficult things to do because of the limitations of the types of suspensions. If the cantus firmus would be in the lower voice, you can have other kind of suspensions, like 4/3 suspensions are very common, 7/6 suspensions, 9/8 suspensions, and of course you can have consonant suspensions as well. And we do have, do we have a consonant suspension? This is not a suspension, it's tied over, but it's not a suspension figure because it doesn't resolve down. No, we don't actually have any consonant suspensions in this particular case, but on the positive side, all of our measures are tied from the second half to the first half note of the next measure. and that is the goal of fourth species. But you may break that pattern as well, so you may have a few half notes where you do not have a tie to the next measure. That is perfectly fine. Anyways, I hope you will try your own fourth species with a given cantus firmus in the upper voice, and send me a message or leave a message on this video if you do so, and if you have any questions. Bye.